Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, November 1st, 2022. The Supreme Court puts a temporary hold on the IRS's giving former President Donald Trump's tax records to the U.S. House Committee, currently led by Democrats. The decision coming from the Chief Justice, John Roberts. Coming up, we'll talk with a reporter from thehill.com about what happens now and also what happens if Republicans win control of the U.S. House after next week's elections. House January 6th Committee Vice Chair, Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, with an update today on whether former President Trump will testify before the committee, as the subpoena from the committee requires him to do. Cybersecurity Administrator Jen Easterly talking about election security 1 week out from voting. President Joe Biden campaigning today in Florida on Social Security, Medicare, and prescription drug costs, in a state that has quite a few retired Americans getting those benefits. A COVID-19 pandemic and flu season update from the CDC Director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, and the Pentagon and State Department responding to reports that Iran is sending another 1,000 weapons to Russia, including surface-to-surface short-range ballistic missiles and attack drones to use in the war in Ukraine. Now to Chief Justice John Roberts granting former President Donald Trump an emergency request not to have to turn over, for now, his tax return to the U.S. House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee. Congressman Bill Pascrell, Democrat from New Jersey, on the committee tweeting, "We've been waiting 1,308 days for Trump's tax returns, almost as long as the American Civil War. The Supreme Court should end this charade and not prolong it with more nonsense." More on this decision from the Supreme Court. We're joined by Toby Burns, a finance reporter with thehill.com. Thank you so much. What legal and constitutional issues does the Chief Justice want to explore by putting this on hold?
Well, there's an argument coming here from the former president's lawyers that say, this is really about presidential audits, while, Trump's attorneys have argued that the matter is purely a political matter. But, this is the general framework that this is happening now. Ways and Means talking about, presidential audits and records and that this is of the public concern, whereas, the defense is really saying this is an ad hominem issue. This is about a specific political condition, and this is the context for that.
This case has been going on for a number of years. Why has it taken so long?
I think that's a great question. I mean, the Bill Pascrell, the Democrat from New Jersey, certainly made that a point in his statement there, saying it, making comparisons, rhetorical comparisons to the Civil War. So obviously, drawing upon some very heated rhetoric there. But there's, of course, there are procedural issues here, with Treasury and its interaction with the IRS. So, but obviously it's hard to get away from the highly politically charged nature of the discussion here.
So the records were due to be turned over this week. Now they're on hold, and they're on hold until at least after Election Day. What does that mean going forward?
There's the rub. Still anticipating here that the House could flip its majority. Obviously, too soon to tell. But if we have a change of power in the lower chamber, obviously, the committee, the committee chairmanship will change, chairpersonship will change, and that means that this could not happen because the Republicans obviously protecting a former president of their own party. So this is crucial, that it's been pushed back over this specific date range that could see a change of power.
What specific records is the committee looking for?
Well, they're looking for financial documentation from the former president. Tax returns obviously have been of major concern in the past, and their various requests have been made to get these returns. The IRS, under Commissioner Charles Rettig, who recently left his post, did not turn over Trump's tax returns. They did not make them public. and received a lot of criticism from Democrats, obviously, over the past several years. But again, Rettig, the former commissioner, has recently left. So we could see a new head of the IRS, which adds another political dimension to this.
In the short term now, what's the next step in this case?
Well, the next step is we need to hear from the Ways and Means Committee, and we need to hear their response because the judge has ordered a stay on the current request for documentation. So a reply from the Ways and Means Committee is the next thing to happen.
Toby Burns is with The Hill, a finance reporter. Find his stories at thehill.com, and on Twitter it's at TobyBurns1. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me.
Supreme Court today also declining to block a subpoena that says that Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina needs to testify in front of a Fulton County, Georgia grand jury investigating phone calls that Senator Graham made to election officials during that time surrounding January 6th, 2021. There were efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. This week, also, the deadline set by the House January 6th committee for former President Trump to comply with subpoena for records and testimony. Committee Vice Chair, Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming, Republican, with an update today, interviewed by PBS's Judy Woodruff at the City Club of Cleveland.
So the committee has subpoenaed former President Trump. I think there's a deadline of Friday for him to comply. Do you think he will? And should the committee allow him to testify in person, live, if that's what he says he'll do?
Well, the committee's in discussions with President Trump's attorneys, and he has an obligation to comply. And, we treat this and take this very seriously. This is not a situation where, the committee is going to put itself at the mercy of Donald Trump in terms of, his efforts to create a circus. You can look back, for example, at his first debate against Joe Biden and sort of what that devolved into. And we believe these matters are very serious. We haven't made determinations about the format itself, but it'll be done under oath. It'll be done potentially over multiple days. We have significant questions based on the evidence that we've developed and as I said, what we know already about the extent to which he was personally and directly involved in every aspect of this effort.
Do you think the odds are that he will testify or not?
I think that he has a legal obligation to testify, but that doesn't always carry weight with Donald Trump.
Congresswoman Liz Cheney, Republican from Wyoming, vice chair of the House Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, interviewed by Judy Woodruff, who is with the PBS NewsHour anchor and managing editor. They were at the City Club of Cleveland today, that audio coming from the club website. Hillary Clinton, former Democratic presidential nominee, asking a federal court today to order former President Trump to pay her legal bills, stemming from a lawsuit that he filed alleging that she and others conspired to undermine his 2016 presidential campaign with accusations of Russian collusion. The lawsuit was dismissed by a federal trial court in September, and the former president is appealing that ruling. Hillary Clinton, in her court filing this week, calling the lawsuit a political stunt. 1 week until the midterm elections, the director of CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, saying the Biden administration has done everything we can to protect election infrastructure and asking the public and the media not to overreact when something may go wrong, and it might, innocently on Election Day or shortly thereafter, and overreaction would undermine the perceived legitimacy of the election. Director Jen Easterly was at a discussion today held by CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington.
I've been talking to these election officials for the past several months, and they have confidence in the integrity of the vote. They are concerned about some of these physical security disinformation. And they asked me to give a message to the American people and to the media. I think this is really important. There are going to be errors, there are going to be glitches. That happens in every election. But that's why there are multiple layers of security controls and resilience built into the system. And so to the media, I would really like to ask for everybody's help, because these things are going to happen, and we can't, that somebody will forget their key to the polling place, a water pipe will burst. These are normal things. They're not nefarious, and I think it's super important that folks get the word out on how elections work. And mostly, as you well know, elections are not over when the polling places close. There's so much work to be done to ensure that there's reconciliation of provisional ballots, counting of absentee ballots, military votes, there's canvassing at the state, local, county level. And so sometimes it takes days, sometimes it takes weeks to certify those elections. And we all need to be patient. We all need to let the machinery of democracy work. We are all in this together. Elections are the golden thread that's woven through the fabric of our democracy. And if that unravels, our republic is at risk. And so we all need to come together to protect what is most sacred. So I just, 7 days out, I'm very passionate about making sure that Americans can vote and have confidence that the vote that they cast is counted.
Jen Easterly is director of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Information Security Administration, at a discussion today about cybersecurity at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Reports of people watching ballot boxes in Arizona, sometimes armed or wearing ballistic vests, reports Associated Press, raise serious concerns about voter intimidation, the Justice Department said Monday as it stepped into a lawsuit over the monitoring. The statement from the Justice Department comes days after a federal judge refused to bar a group from monitoring the outdoor drop boxes in the suburbs of Phoenix. The article goes on, threats, intimidation, and coercion are illegal under the Federal Voting Rights Act, even if they don't succeed, the government's attorneys wrote. While lawful poll watching can support transparency, ballot security forces present a significant risk of voter intimidation, the court documents state. State officials, often in charge of ensuring the voting process is smooth and safe, is the Secretary of State. And today, two of them, one Republican, one Democrat, talking about what is being done, actually a former one on the Republican side. The acting Pennsylvania Secretary of State, Lee Chapman, leading off.
The mis and disinformation really fuels the threats to election workers at the state level, at the local level. And it's something that's very concerning, but we see a direct connection between the trends of the misinformation and when threats pick up. So we coordinate with our state and federal partners. As I mentioned before, when we get any incoming into our office, we forward it to state and federal partners. They investigate that, we refer it, and we encourage our counties to do the same thing. We are definitely monitoring situations as voting is happening right now, especially at drop boxes, for instance. We actually updated our voter intimidation guidance in Pennsylvania just a few months ago to include that voter intimidation is not only illegal under state and federal law at the polling place, but that also extends to drop boxes. And that's a new trend that we've seen. Everybody has seen an uptick in Arizona. Luckily, we have not seen any Arizona-style intimidation in Pennsylvania, but it's something that we are monitoring, and we did add that to our voter intimidation guidance. And we are pushing out our hotline. So we are encouraging voters, of course, if you're in imminent threat or danger, you call 911, but we are really pushing out our voter hotline to ensure that people can call us and report those instances of the Department of State, because it's important that we are keeping a log, seeing if there's any trends. But we aren't wasting any time. As soon as something does come in, we are reporting it directly to state and federal as soon as we can to make sure that people are protected. But those tabletop exercises that we've had, that we mentioned before, have been really critical to ensure that counties have the protection that they need. One great thing that Department of Homeland Security, CISA, does is they actually go out to the counties at their request, and they do physical security assessments. So quite a few counties in Pennsylvania have taken them up on that offer. They've had assessments to their physical security. They give recommendations. CISA gives recommendations as far as what they can do to shore up their security, where their machines are stored or what have you. And counties have made adjustments to shore up that security based on what DHS is recommending.
Lee Chapman is Pennsylvania's acting Secretary of State. A virtual discussion today about election threats hosted by the Center for American Progress. Also on the panel, former Kentucky Secretary of State Trey Grayson, who says things have gotten a bit worse in recent years and states like his have had to step up.
Yeah, well, I mean, we are in a just uncharted waters with this, just in the last couple of years alone. You mentioned the attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband. We had somebody show up in the neighborhood for Justice Kavanaugh looking for him. Fortunately, he and his family weren't home. A couple of years ago, we had the shooting at the Republicans practicing for the congressional baseball game, and then, going back to Congresswoman Giffords. In other instances, I mean, it's we didn't have to worry about this in the election space, this level and this severity of violence. But the good news is it is happening while there's a good level of cooperation among federal and state and local with intelligence gathering coming out of that 2016 election. But it's unusual. We're having to adapt law. Secretary Chapman mentioned the fact that traditionally we had these electioneering free zones to protect folks who went in to go vote so they couldn't be intimidated or put under any duress or undue influence. And those were restrictions of a few hundred feet or so around a polling place. We had to balance the First Amendment rights of folks to share their views on elections. But when it rises to a level of intimidation or harassment, that's where your First Amendment right stops, and somebody else's rights to be able to vote without all that steps in. And so we're having to adapt that because now people are voting in advance of Election Day. And some states, Kentucky, we just added a few early voting days. We have to add that. And then on the drop boxes, because drop boxes, what's extraordinary about all the news about drop boxes is I think it's something like 8 states used them prior to the 2020 election. Now, we always have had drop boxes. There are those blue boxes that USPS sticker on the side, or you have one in front of your house or your building called a mailbox. Those are drop boxes too. But now we have these official, more secure drop boxes. And people now know that, hey, if I see somebody going there, then they have a ballot and they're voting, and which has created an opportunity, for our bad actors. So we have to provide that protection. And we also have to figure out how to use those existing laws and then adapt them to provide that safeguard. I think for folks who are worried about things like that, you can bring things into buildings. Buildings have more security. You can go to other drop boxes. You can ask for report. You can mail things. I mean, there are ways to handle this. It's an unfortunate way to live in this kind of world. But in the same way, in our everyday lives, we have to kind of pay attention and see what's going on. Unfortunately, when we're casting a vote, performing our civic duty, we may have to do a little bit of that too. My hope is that this will be, that some of these safeguards will result in a good election day. I mean, what's tricky about all this is when we talk about these things, this is always this balance. If we talk about them, are we creating a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy? The reason why we're talking about it is we think it's risen to a serious enough threat that we're going to run the risk of giving somebody an idea that they might otherwise not have had, because so many people already have that idea. And we need to make sure that voters can empower themselves and election administrators can put those protections in place. So it is a serious threat. Hopefully we'll wake up the day after the election saying, we did all that preparation and it paid off, and we had a good, clean election day.
Trey Grayson was Kentucky's Secretary of State from 2004 through 11. He was a Republican, speaking at today's Center for American Progress discussion about election threats. You can find the full video at cspan.org. And the man accused of breaking into House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's home and assaulting her husband with a hammer, making his first court appearance today on state charges in San Francisco. Prosecutors and police say it was a politically motivated attack. The charges include attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, elder abuse, residential burglary, false imprisonment, threatening the life of or seriously bodily harm to a public official. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges, but is being held currently without bond, a bail hearing set for Friday. President Biden campaigning today in Florida on behalf of the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate there, Congresswoman Val Demings, and also the candidate for governor, Congressman Charlie Crist, a Democrat. Val Demings running against the Republican incumbent Senator Marco Rubio, and Charlie Crist against incumbent Republican Governor Ron DeSantis. He gave a speech at Hallandale, Florida, focusing on Social Security, Medicare, and prescription drug costs. The president pointing to a budget plan from Florida's other U.S. Senator, Republican Rick Scott, his 12-point plan to rescue America, which advocates for periodic review of entitlement programs.
If Republicans in the Congress have their way, the power we just gave Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices goes away, gone. $2,000 cap on prescription drugs, gone. $35 a month cap on Medicare for insulin for Medicare, gone. Savings on health care premiums of $800 a year for millions of Americans in the Affordable Care Act, gone. And of course, they're still determined to do away with the entire Affordable Care Act. That means an end to protection for tens of millions of people who can't get insurance because they have a pre-existing condition. Only means to do that is through the Affordable Care Act. If the Republicans get their way, that's going to be gone as well. And folks, it gets even worse. They're coming after Social Security and Medicare in a big way. Folks here in Florida, you need to know this, and I mean this sincerely. You need to know this. You need to know why. Because of your own senator, Senator Rick Scott. I have the brochure here he has. He's in charge of electing Republicans to the Senate. He's the head of the campaign. And he laid out a clear plan. He said every 5 years, Social Security and Medicare would have to be reauthorized. And this is from the report. I made it larger, listed all they want to do. Quote, all federal legislation sunsets, means goes out of existence in 5 years. If the law is worth keeping, Congress will pass it again. So every 5 years, the Congress will have to vote to reauthorize Social Security. Reauthorize it, or else it goes away. Would have to vote to reauthorize Medicare, reauthorize veterans' benefits. And I go down the list, but guess what? The very idea that a senator from Florida wants to cut Social Security and Medicare, and by the way, they don't have to go away, they can cut it. They can change it, basically. A senator from Florida going after Medicare and Social Security? I tell you what, I don't know where, as they say in Southern, don't know where y'all been. Hot damn, boy.
President Biden in Hallandale, Florida today. Ahead of that speech, even before the president arrived, Senator Rick Scott tweeting, "Welcome to Florida, President Biden. Looking forward to hearing you explain to Floridians why you cheated on your taxes and think you should get away with it." Attached was this video.
Joe Biden just cut $280 billion from Medicare, and we know about his 80,000 new IRS agents. But what you don't know is that Joe Biden also cheated on his taxes and got away with it. Biden improperly used a loophole to dodge $500,000 in taxes that should have gone to Medicare. And now that Biden has ripped off Medicare for $500,000, he wants to close the loophole and raise your taxes. I'm Rick Scott. Biden should resign. I approve this message.
Senator Rick Scott tweeting that video. He is the chair of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which raises money and spends money on behalf of Republican Senate candidates. He has been traveling around the country campaigning, being at events as well on their behalf. About that charge of President Biden owing taxes, a New York Post article from about a year ago cites Republican Congressman Jim Banks saying that according to criteria provided by the Congressional Research Service, President Biden improperly used S corporations to avoid paying Medicare tax on speaking fees and book sales in 2017 and 18. And on Senator Scott's claim that the president has cut Medicare spending, PolitiFact writes that the claim is wrong. The federal government would see its outlays reduced between $237 billion and $288 billion as a result of Medicare drug price negotiation provision in the Inflation Reduction Act. However, the reduction would not represent cuts to Medicare beneficiaries. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Live Wednesday on C-SPAN Radio. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell holds a news conference. He's expected to approve a fourth straight interest rate hike. Listen tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time on the C-SPAN Now mobile app, online at cspan.org, or ask your smart speaker to play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast. Find it wherever you get your podcasts or on the C-SPAN Now video app. Some of the day's headlines on COVID-19. This from MarketWatch. Hospitalizations are rising again in New York City with the spread of new COVID-19 subvariants that are better at evading immunity. Cases of flu and respiratory virus, RSV, also increasing. And from Axios, the D.C. Council, Washington, D.C., considering suspending the city's student COVID-19 vaccine mandate as vaccination rates lag. It's been challenging for schools to enforce the requirement that all students, including public, private, and parochial, get their first COVID shot. As of September 17th, around 46% of D.C. public school students were still out of compliance. The director of the CDC, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, giving a national update today on COVID-19, an event hosted by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
In terms of where we are now, we are tracking at CDC about 40,000 cases of COVID every day. Our hospital admissions are at about 3,200, and our deaths are somewhere between 350 and 400 per day. While that is markedly different, markedly lower than we have seen in some of our prior high peaks, of course, I am still personally disturbed that we are at 400 deaths a day and that continues. In terms of cases, we recognize that we are testing using PCR tests much less than we previously did. We had been using PCRs, up to 3 million PCRs every single day. Now, with the more and more use of rapid tests, we recognize we're not tracking every single case. But as a colleague of mine said, and I really think it merits repeating, we don't need to count every raindrop to know how hard it's raining. So we're following these trends very carefully, but we still are doing somewhere in the 300 to 400,000 PCRs a day. So we really do have a good sense of how our cases are trending. I think what's most important to recognize right now in this moment is part of the way that we traversed from where we were in May of 2021 to where we are today is through many people getting infected, many deaths, of course, but importantly through vaccination. And it is that immunity, both through natural infection, but really through vaccination, that has allowed us to be where we are today, where we are living with this virus. What's important about that is we know that immunity can wane. We know it wanes over time. And so in this moment right now, what I'd really like to encourage businesses to do is to encourage vaccination among people within their businesses. Because if people are able to remain up to date on their vaccines, and that includes getting their most recent bivalent vaccine, then that immunity will last longer. It will likely be broader, and we will likely be able to maintain that immunity and maintain where we are in living with this virus. And I would say that's true both for COVID vaccination, but also for flu vaccination. I know we'll touch on that later.
Dr. Rochelle Walensky is director of the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, at a U.S. Chamber of Commerce virtual program today. Dr. Walensky said on Monday that she has tested positive again for COVID-19 in a rebound case after completing a course of Pfizer's COVID pill Paxlovid. Joining President Joe Biden and Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, who went through the exact same thing. As Dr. Walensky just mentioned, also coming up in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce discussion, flu season.
So as we head into winter, there are a lot of headlines about a triple threat, and we talked a little bit about children and what's going on there. But how are you thinking about the forecast for this winter, both with COVID-19 and flu?
I'm chuckling because there's a famous line that says, you've seen one flu season, you've seen one flu season. So we don't always know what's going to happen with flu, and we certainly know that COVID-19 has given us some curveballs. Here's what I can tell you about where we are with flu right now. Right now, we are seeing an early flu season. It's mostly influenza A. We've seen early flu hospitalizations. We've seen higher rates of influenza hospitalizations at this time in the year than we have since 2010-2011 season. In the South, where they get flu before us, we also saw an early influenza season, and it didn't necessarily end up more severe. It just ended up being early. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be where we land. It doesn't always predict where we land. But we are starting to see, especially in the South, especially in the Southeast, flu ticking up. We did tragically have our first pediatric death of flu this last week. And so again, this is one of those places we know that vaccination against flu also protects against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. There is maybe just a minute on the flu vaccine to say, some people say, well, when it's not a good match, it doesn't work. And what our data consistently demonstrate is even when it's not a perfect match season after season, we have seen that people who have gotten the flu vaccine tend to have less severe disease than people who did not. So we don't have to have a perfect match to have a really important reason to get flu vaccine. And in terms of what we are anticipating, we're seeing RSV much earlier than we normally do. We've seen flu now earlier than we normally do. And we are heading into cold winter months, respiratory virus season. We do know respiratory viruses tend to thrive in those winter months. And so that's really why we're trying to do all that we can. Maybe one last thing is I think as we just talk about all of these respiratory viruses is one really important thing that businesses can do is to ensure that they have good ventilation systems in their business workplaces, because that really does make a difference in terms of filtering out pathogens so that there are not those pathogens circulating.
Dr. Rochelle Walensky, director of the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a virtual discussion with the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Suzanne Clark. On Wall Street, the Dow down 79, NASDAQ down 97, S&P down 15. From Bloomberg, U.S. job openings unexpectedly rebounded in September amid low unemployment, likely fueling further wage gains and adding pressure on the Federal Reserve to extend its aggressive campaign to curb inflation. The number of available positions increased to 10.7 million in September from a revised 10.3 million a month earlier. The Labor Department's Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or JOLTS, showed on Tuesday. And the Federal Reserve is expected to raise interest rates again on Wednesday by 0.75 percentage point. Now to Russia's war in Ukraine. This from Reuters. Russia told civilians on Tuesday to leave a swath of Ukraine along the eastern bank of the Dnipro River, a major extension of an evacuation order that Kyiv says amounts to the forced depopulation of occupied territory. Russia, which claims to have annexed the area, says it's taking civilians to safety because of the risk Ukraine might use unconventional weapons. In this story from CNN, Iran preparing to send approximately 1,000 additional weapons, including surface-to-surface short-range ballistic missiles and more attack drones, to Russia to use in its war against Ukraine. Officials from a Western country that closely monitors Iran's weapons program told CNN. The shipment is being closely monitored because it would be the first instance of Iran sending advanced precision guidance missiles to Russia, which could give the Kremlin a substantial boost on the battlefield. That reporting from CNN. Reaction to that news today from the State Department spokesman, Ned Price.
3 officials, U.S. and Western government officials, saying that Iran is preparing to send short-range ballistic missiles to Russia, part of a tranche of weapons, including weaponized drones that are supposed to be sent by the end of the year. So this is not sent already, but preparing to deliver, if you have anything on that. And to us, Iran has not commented when we went to the UN mission. I also wanted to ask, but I don't know, I want to defer to Matt if he wants to ask about the Saudi alerts and whether we have confirmation about that.
Sure. So on your first question, we've spoken for quite some time now about some of the dire supply shortages that Russia is facing. These owe, at least in part, to the export controls that the United States and a number of other countries have placed on Moscow's industrial base, but also its military industrial base, starving Russia of the inputs that it needs to indigenously produce components for efforts in its war against Ukraine. We are concerned that Russia may also seek to acquire advanced conventional weapons from Iran, such as surface-to-surface missiles that will almost certainly be used to support Russia's war against Ukraine. We've spoken before about our efforts using all appropriate means to expose, to deter, to confront Iran's provision of these munitions against the Ukrainian people. We will continue to vigorously enforce all U.S. sanctions on both the Russian and Iranian arms trade to make it harder for Iran to sell these weapons to Russia, to help the Ukrainians have what they need to defend against these threats. And we'll stand with our partners throughout the Middle East and against the Iranian threat that many of them also face. To put a finer point on it, anyone doing business with Iran that could have any links to its UAV or ballistic missile development or the flow of arms from Iran to Russia should be very careful. They should do their due diligence. We will not hesitate to use our sanctions. We will not hesitate to use any appropriate and effective tool. This goes back to what we had been saying since July. It was over the summer that the National Security Advisor first went out to the White House podium to make the point that Iran at that time was planning to sell UAVs to Russia for use against Ukraine. We have since confirmed the delivery of dozens of these UAVs from Iran to Russia that have been employed by Russians against the innocent people of Ukraine. So whether the source is Iran, whether the source is indigenously produced Russian weapons and munitions, whether Russia continues its engagement with the DPRK, for example, that I think showcases the necessity of going well beyond what would otherwise be its comfort zone to source weapons and material for this war effort. We will use every appropriate tool to confront, to expose that.
The U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price with reporters in the State Department briefing room. That question coming from NBC News' Andrea Mitchell. Russia has been using the missiles and armed drones in effective attacks against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, especially electric power plants, causing widespread outages and disruption of clean drinking water supplies. Andrea Mitchell, referring to this in her question, there was another issue that the United States and Saudi Arabia are on high alert after Saudi intelligence shared with the U.S. indicated that Iran is expected to carry out an attack on targets in Saudi Arabia, the Wall Street Journal initially reporting. More, though, on this potential 1,000 more weapons Iran's sending to Russia to use in Ukraine. Over at the Pentagon, the Press Secretary General Pat Ryder telling reporters they're aware of it, and also asked a question about what it says about Russia's military.
Is there anything else that can be read into that, such as Russia's munitions are actually in a depleted state, and does it add any urgency to getting air defense systems like the NASAMS onto the battlefield?
Well, I think it does speak to the state of Russia's munitions capability. We've said before that we assess that they continue to experience supply shortages when it comes to munitions, particularly guided munitions. It also is indicative of where they're seeking munitions from countries like North Korea and Iran, which says a lot about the kind of company they keep and where they stand in the world right now in terms of isolation. In terms of air defense capabilities, this continues to be a priority for the U.S. government, for the Department of Defense to work closely with the Ukrainians, with our allies and our partners to try to get them additional air defense capability. As you highlighted with the NASAMS, we expect those to be delivered very soon. Again, we'll allow the Ukrainians to announce when those arrive in country, but we're going to continue to look at other ways that we can support them. In addition, Secretary Austin continues to speak frequently with his partners and our allies, his counterparts, to identify what other capabilities might exist within their own stocks or within their own defense industrial bases to be able to support Ukraine in that regard. Thank you.
The Pentagon Press Secretary, Air Force Brigadier General Pat Ryder, with reporters today in the Pentagon briefing room. NASAMS is the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System. North Korea's foreign minister today warning the United States about joint military exercises with South Korea that are ongoing and scheduled through Friday. The statement from the North reading, if the U.S. continuously persists in the grave military provocations, the DPRK will take into account more powerful follow-up measures. North Korea, or DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, has test-fired over 20 ballistic missiles in the region this year, and there have been reports all this year that North Korea may be preparing for another nuclear weapons test. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. You can subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.